Hello, welcome to Abnormal Psychology. I am June Ganikosa Hebrew, a licensed professional teacher and a registered psychologist in the Philippines. This is one of the most interesting areas in psychology because it deals with questions people already ask in everyday life. And sometimes we usually have strong opinions about it, but we all know they're not always accurate. So, for example, people casually say things like, depressed na yata siya, may anxiety ako, bipolar yan, or that person is crazy. But in psychology, we cannot afford to be careless with labels. Words like these are not just casual descriptions. They can shape how a person is judged, treated, misunderstood, or even stigmatized. So, in this course, we are not here to memorize dramatic terms or diagnose people from a distance. We are here to understand when thoughts, emotions, and behaviors become clinically significant, meaning they are no longer just part of ordinary stress or personality, but are already causing real distress, dysfunction, impairment, or loss of control. In other words, abnormal psychology is not about calling people abnormal. It is about learning how to think carefully, scientifically, and compassionately about psychological suffering. So, how do we study abnormal psychology? Una, I think you should know that the worst way to study abnormal psychology is to treat it like a shopping list. Depression, check. Anxiety, check. OCD, check. And then after 2 hours, parang lahat na lang ng symptom magkakamuka. At biglang lahat ng tao sa paligid mo mukhang may diagnosis. That's dangerous, alright? That's not learning. That's just academic overconfidence. So a better way is to study in layers. First, understand the foundations. What abnormality means, why defining disorder is not as simple as it sounds, and why context matters. Second, understand diagnosis and assessment before jumping into labels. And third, study disorders by families and patterns and not as random isolated chapters. So, for example, if all you know is that panic disorder involves panic attacks, kulang na kulang pa yan. A college student can panic before recitation or after 3 cups of coffee or if 2 hours lang ang sleep, no? At isang message na, can we talk? Hindi ibig sabihin nun, panic disorder agad. So, ang goal dito is not just memorization. Again, the goal is clinical thinking. Meaning, marunong kang tumingin sa severity, duration, pattern, at effects sa functioning bago ka mag-conclude. Now, why does abnormal psychology matter? Abnormal psychology matters because psychological disorders are not rare side stories. Hindi ito pang pelikula lang, or pang thesis lang, or pang clinical setting lang. They affect real people in real life. Students, teachers, barkada, pamilya, romantic relationships, and entire communities. For college students, alright? This is very relevant because this is the season where pressure, okay, identity issues, uncertainty, deadlines for project, comparison with other people, no, including family expectations, heartbreak mo sa ex mo, and burnout are all active, no, simultaneously happening. So, minsan nga, parang isang group project pa lang, parang lahat na pagdaanan mo na lahat di ba? So, again, we're saying not everything is a disorder. Hindi lahat ng pagod ay may depression na kaagad, no? Hindi lahat ng kaba anxiety disorder na. Hindi lahat ng mood swing bipolar. At hindi lahat ng toxic narcissist means hindi lahat ay toxic narcissist. Minsan inconsiderate lang talaga, no? So some patterns do become clinically important and knowing the difference actually matters. The subject matters because people are still very careless with mental health language. Depression gets called laziness, anxiety gets called weakness, trauma gets called pagiging dramatic. So, abnormal psychology helps us become more accurate, more humane, and less memasabi lang when talking about psychological suffering. So, how will we study abnormal psychology together? So we are going to study this subject in a sequence that makes sense. First, we define abnormality. Then we look at the history of how abnormal behavior was understood. After that, we move into modern models of psychopathology, then diagnosis and assessment, and later on, the major disorder families. Now, you might be wondering, bakit ganito yung sequence? Because if we jump straight into the disorders, tendencies for students to become too fast with labels. Isang symptom lang, diagnosis agad. Okay, after one TikTok video, everyone suddenly has trauma or ADHD, attachment issues, and a narcissistic ex, no? Masyadong mabilis mag-diagnose, masyadong confident, no? Mabilis yung Mbps ng internet ng utak. So, but real clinical thinking is slower, right? For example, if a student says, ayoko nang lumabas ng bahay, that could mean depression, social anxiety, burnout, grief, shame, trauma, or simple, pwede namang gusto lang na umiwas sa groupmates, no? And honestly, valid kahit yung last doon, no, na gustong umiwas sa groupmates, alright? And I think you can all relate to that. Now, our roadmap starts with defining abnormality because that is the doorway into the whole field. Then we move into history because the way people understood abnormal behavior changed a lot over time. After that, we study modern explanatory models and then diagnosis and assessment and later the major disorder families. So, isipin nyo na lang, nagtatayo kayo ng bahay, you don't start with aesthetic. You will not buy chandelier agad kung wala pa namang pader yung bahay mo. No? So, ang kinang-kinang ng chandelier, wala kang pader. So, structurally, it doesn't make sense, right? So, the first part is really about building the foundation, where we are training the mind to think carefully about context, meaning, severity, impairment, and judgment. Para pagdating natin sa actual disorders, hindi kayo basta nagme-memorize ang symptoms na parang reviewer lang. So you will understand how the pieces fit together. And that will lead us to part 1, the foundations of abnormal psychology. Mukhang basic ito, but this is actually the part that keeps us from becoming sloppy thinkers. Without foundations, people either over-pathologize normal human experience or minimize serious psychological problems. Halimbawa, if someone cries every day for 1 week after a breakup, it does not mean major depressive disorder. If someone is very nervous, right, before reporting, that does not automatically mean na generalized anxiety disorder na siya. If someone prefers being alone and avoids small talk, that does not automatically mean psychopathology. Minsan baka introverted lang, or minsan baka pagod lang, or probably socially selective, and honestly those things are understandable. So this part teaches us to ask better questions. What counts as abnormal? Compared to what? Based on whose standard and in what context? And what is the consequence on functioning? Those questions matter because, again, psychology is not just about noticing behavior. It is about interpreting it carefully. Abnormal psychology, right? I told you that we'll start with a definition, okay? Abnormal psychology is the scientific study of psychological disorders. In simple terms, it studies patterns of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that become distressing, impairing, difficult to regulate, or clinically significant. Again, clinically significant. Wait lang, parang kulang yata yung ilaw ko. Alright. Sorry na. Ayan, sana kita nyo na ako. Madilim kanina. There you go. Okay. Ayan. So, again, the word scientific is important. Ibig sabihin, hindi tayo aasa sa stereotypes, assumptions, vibes, or kung ano lang ang sabi ng friend mong nakaisang psych subject at biglang naging life coach na, no? We look at evidence, research patterns, and clinical observation. At the same time, this field is deeply human. It deals with experiences like not being able to get out of bed, for example, not being able to stop overthinking, feeling emotionally flat for a long time, or nakakarinig ng boses, or becoming so anxious that your life starts shrinking around your fear. So, abnormal psychology is both scientific and compassionate. Hindi lang ito tungkol sa labels, it is also about understanding suffering in a careful, responsible, and humane way. At first, many people think abnormal simply means weird, unusual, or different. But in psychology, that is too simplistic. Not everything unusual is disordered, and not everything disordered looks unusual right away. In practice, we often think about abnormality in terms of distress, dysfunction, impairment, danger, and violation of important social norms. But none of these alone is enough. For example, a college student can be very distressed after failing an exam or getting ghosted by someone they like, or maybe a college student can be very distressed, okay, surviving on iced coffee, all right, and maybe in denial for 3 straight days, no, na hindi na siya mahal ng taong minamahal niya. Totoong distressed ba siya? Oo. But mental disorder agad? Not necessarily. On the other hand, the person is in a manic state. No, the person may be in a manic state, may feel amazing, confident, energized, brilliant, unstoppable. Habang siya feeling main character, everyone around them can already see that they are becoming reckless, impulsive, sleepless, and disconnected from reality. So abnormality is not just about feeling bad or looking strange. It is about whether there is a meaningful pattern of disturbance and impairment that is actually affecting real life functioning. So, what makes it difficult to define abnormality? Right? One reason abnormality is difficult to define is that many psychological symptoms also exist in normal life, right? Sadness, for example, exists in both grief and depression. Fear exists in both danger and phobia. Distractibility can appear in both sleep deprivation and ADHD. Suspiciousness can appear in both trauma and paranoia. So, we cannot define abnormality by spotting one symptom and acting like we solved the case. We're not in a detective movie na isang clue lang tapos dramatic reveal agad. So, we have to ask, how severe is it? How often does it happen? How long has it been happening? In what context? And how much is it affecting functioning? So two students may both say, I overthink everything. One may simply be stressed, perfectionistic, and kulang sa tulog. The other may be dealing with severe anxiety, constant worry, muscle tension, sleep problems, and poor concentration. Same line but very different clinical meaning. That is why defining abnormality requires judgment. Hindi pwedeng symptom lang, right? Tapos diagnosis agad. Kung ganun lang sana kadali, edi lahat tayo ay lisensyado na by now. Now, let's look at how DSM view mental disorder. The DSM tries to provide a clinically useful definition of mental disorder. In general, it describes mental disorder as a clinically significant disturbance. Again, clinically significant disturbance in cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects dysfunction in either psychological, biological, or developmental processes, and usually is associated with distress or disability. What is important here is that the DSM tries to separate disorder from ordinary pain, social conflict, and simple nonconformity. For example, being angry about injustice is not a mental disorder, right? Being different from the majority is not automatically a mental disorder. Having a painful reaction to a major life event is not automatically a mental disorder either. In short, the DSM is saying not every painful experience can be equated to psychopathology, and not every unusual person is disordered. Kailangan may clinically meaningful disturbance and dysfunction. Otherwise, diagnosis becomes careless. And when diagnosis becomes careless, people get mislabeled. Hindi pwedeng may one bad week ka lang tapos biglang buo na ang personality diagnosis mo courtesy of your minamahal na blockmate. Okay? So there are three core features we often used in the definition. When people try to define abnormality, we often come up with distress, dysfunction or disability, and deviance from social norms. Remember the 3 Ds, right? First, distress. Is the person suffering? That matters, but it is not enough. Because a person may be deeply distressed because life is genuinely painful, and that does not automatically mean mental disorder. Second, dysfunction. Is a person's way of thinking, feeling, or behaving seriously interfering with school? Okay? Talaga bang seryoso nakaka-interfere siya sa school, work, relationship, self-care, daily life? And this is often one of the most clinically useful clues. Someone may say, okay lang ako, pero hindi na pumapasok, hindi makatulog, hindi makafocus, hindi na kumakain, no? Halos wala ng ganang mabuhay. Clearly, if you notice this, something important is happening, no? So this is dysfunction. Third, deviance from social norms. This is the behavior far outside what the culture considers acceptable or expected. But again, we must be careful because not everything unusual is pathological. Some people are simply eccentric, highly creative, no? Yung iba deeply spiritual lang talaga. Alright? Nabiwirduhan tayo sa mga iba. Socially awkward, no? Hindi ibig sabihin autistic na, or maybe just allergic to small talk. Okay, tapos feeling natin may social anxiety na. So these 3 features, again, no, help us think, but none of them should be used like shortcut. Diagnosis is not instant noodles, no? Hindi pwedeng add hot water, wait 3 minutes, tapos like, may psychopathology na kayo kaagad. Alright? It doesn't happen that way. So again, let's sum that up. First is distress, second dysfunction, and last, deviance. Okay, those are the 3 Ds in the definition of abnormal psychology, courtesy of the DSM. Now, let's talk about the historical overview of abnormal psychology. Why is it important to study this? Because it helps us to explain abnormal behavior or explanation of abnormal behavior across history. Human beings have always tried to make sense of unusual behavior because that's natural to us. But the explanations changed depending on the culture, time period, and knowledge available. At different points in history, abnormal behavior was explained through supernatural ideas, right? Biological explanations, psychological theories, and later more integrative models. In one era, people thought the cause was possession or demonic influence. In another, they focused on bodily imbalance or brain disturbance. Later, thinkers started examining emotion, learning, no, paraan pag-aaral ng tao, conflict, and the inner life of the person. Why does this matter? Again, because it reminds us that psychology did not arrive fully formed and automatically correct. As a matter of fact, the field, no, still evolving, no matter how evolved we think it is already. And it evolved sometimes, no, through serious mistakes, and people with mental health problems were feared, no, kinakatakutan, pinapunish, ina-isolate, and misunderstood. And I think in some of the provinces, right, here in the Philippines, not just here, but also in other countries, ganun pa rin ang ginagawa nila. So history gives us more than facts. It gives us perspective. It reminds us not to become too arrogant about what we currently think we know. Kasi baka mamaya, 100 years from now, tayo naman ang nasa slide na things people used to believe with too much confidence. No? So nagbabago talaga ang psychology. Let's talk about the supernatural tradition, alright? In the supernatural tradition, abnormal behavior was often explained as the result of spirits. Mga spirito sa paligid. mga demonyo, no? Demons, curses, sinumpa, or dahil sa ikaw ay makasalanan or possession, alright? May sanib. So when people saw behavior that was bizarre, agitated, violent, disorganized, or difficult to explain, they often used spiritual explanations because that was the framework available to them. But before we judge too quickly, remember, people usually explain what they do not understand using the language their culture gives them. But today, we have research, we have diagnostic manuals, may neuroscience tayo, which is a very interesting field, and also we have different psychological theories that earlier societies did not have. The problem is that supernatural explanations often led to fear-based responses. Kaya yung mga tao kinatatakutan nila, no, instead of care-based responses. So a person might be isolated, no, kinukulong sa isang kwarto, or pinapunish, okay? We've heard stories of that, no, na nakakadena yung mga what they call to be mongoloid, no, in the provinces, right? And they are tapos they're treated as morally corrupted, no, rather than being helped. Makasalanan ka kasi, alright? Hindi ka nagre-reflect, okay, ganyan. And this is not only historical, alright? Hanggang ngayon, even today, some people still interpret psychosis as possession, alright? Depression as weak faith, or trauma symptoms as spiritual failure. So, the supernatural tradition is not just a chapter from the past. Hanggang ngayon, may multo pa rin siya, okay, figuratively and culturally, in the way people think about mental health today. And so that ends our lecture mini-series, okay, part 1. Next up, we will have our part 2, and we will talk about how abnormal behavior is explained. So, stay tuned. Okay, I'll be uploading part 2 once it's done. Thank you so much for tuning in.